Hi everyone, welcome to our module on power and politics in innovation. So we have actually referenced some of this stuff in some of our earlier modules and in some of our earlier workshops. So I hope you're getting a sense that understanding how power operates in organisations and understanding how political activity operates in organisations is going to be critical for us in understanding how to manage innovation in those organisations. So along with our module on social networks, this one is also what I'd say a fairly dense module. So there's quite a bit of content in here and a few readings I've got up on Blackboard there for you to look through. But I hope you find it really interesting because as this quote on our first slide indicates, understanding how power and politics works is important, but we probably have all to some extent had some experience in it or of it. So I really like this quote. I like all my quotes, but I like this one particularly. So it says, all of us are neck deep in politics every day of our lives, and every organisation on earth that involves human beings has its politics. So those are two sentences that I particularly like. And I think I put this up in our topic overview up on Blackboard for this module. If there's an organisation that has more than two people, then you already have the groundwork for political activity to start to be in play. Now, one of the things that you'll find, or I hope you find throughout this lecture, is that there are two sides to politics and understanding how politics works in organisations. For some of you, and I know for me at some point in my working life, quite early on, if the word politics was used, I had a very negative view of it. I thought politics meant people playing games and people doing irrational things and people letting their self-interest get in the way of decision-making, all that kind of stuff. And certainly politics can be that. And so we'll look at some of the games that individuals can play in organisations that we call political games. There's an emerging view of political activity in organisation that says actually there's another side to it, that when we talk about politics, it doesn't need to have negative connotations, that actually engaging in political activity can be constructive in organisations, that actually one way we can define politics is simply as the way to get people's interests out on the table, and often we will have different interests in organisations, particularly large, diverse, complex organisations, and that's okay. Political activity is about understanding those interests and trying to reconcile them in some way to get to a point of collaboration. So throughout this lecture, you'll probably get a sense there's a tension here. Politics can have two different sides and two different meanings. And so we're going to dive into a little bit of that in this module. So these are our learning outcomes. So this is what I want you to be able to understand by the end of it. So firstly, as in all of our modules, be able to define some key terms here. So what we mean by power, its types and its sources. I'll talk about that at the start. In organisations, and also be able to define what we mean by politics. So I've already given you a sense that there's a couple of definitions we can use here, more of a positive one of a more challenging or negative one, and be able to identify some political games that we'll go through that can be used in organisations. I also want you to particularly be able to explain, as with all of our modules, how an understanding of power and politics is important for our understanding and exploration of managing innovation, and the pros and cons of engaging in political activity. So again, as we've already talked about, there are two sides of the coin here, so I want you to be clear about what those are when we talk about politics. I also want you to be able to identify through lenses of power and politics, so the concepts that we'll be talking about, I want you to be comfortable that you can take an innovation, a focal innovation, and be able to analyse it in terms of, okay, what power bases and what power sources are in use here by individuals trying to make this innovation happen, or trying to thwart it? What political games might be played here to try and stop this innovation, or perhaps try to facilitate its movement through an organisation? And so that will come to, for example, in your group case study report. So you might find that this particular module is very relevant to your case in your group case study report. Point 4 there, so I want you to be able to apply a model of political skill to understand your own abilities in this area and those of others. So later on in the lecture, we'll look at a little model which has some very interesting terms like donkey and innocent and those sorts of things to try and label individuals' political skill in organisations. And I wanted us to touch on this because I want you to be mindful and be reflective of, so this might relate to something you might want to discuss in your reflective journal assessment piece. I want you to be able to reflect on how comfortable you think you are in terms of your own political skill and how you've seen it used in organisations, maybe whether you've used it in organisations or in certain social situations, and get you to think about that from your own perspective. And finally, I want you to be able to apply just a fairly simple stakeholder analysis tool. So I don't want us to spend a lot of time on that, but I simply wanted to introduce you to what stakeholder analysis is. Again, this might be relevant for your group case study report. Understand what it is, a fairly simple tool that you can use to sort of map different stakeholders' interests when you're talking about a focal innovation. And that in turn helps us understand, okay, how should we influence those stakeholders? Who are the ones that are most important, least important? Who are the ones that might enable our innovation? What power bases do they have? But also look at who might be disabling for us, who might be a disabling force in managing innovation, who might be trying to stop us or thwart us, and how do we manage that? And so let's start by looking at, okay, what is power and politics in innovation? So one of the readings that I had up there as optional up on Blackboard was a reading by Frost and Egri. It's a bit of a harder read, but I'd really encourage you to look through it. It's one of those really seminal or super important pieces of work. One of the very few I've found that actually explicitly looks in depth at what power and politics mean for innovation. So for Frost and Egri, they say that in modern organisations, any particular innovation intrudes on a previously negotiated set of agreements about how interests and priorities are to be accommodated. Basically, what they're saying is, because innovation is about something new, it doesn't need to be super big new, but something has to change. So an innovation is about changing something, whether it's a product or a process or a service or whatever, introducing something different, making people work in a different way. It's changing something up to some extent. So what that means is the status quo is going to be shifted. So what people might be comfortable with, we've talked about all the reasons why we're very averse to change. When we upset the status quo and you're changing situations people are comfortable with, then you might be treading on their interests, what they think is important. You might be treading on what they think is valuable. And so when you start to do that, then you can automatically start to activate people's power bases. They might use their power bases to support you or to thwart or to stop you. And one of the ways that they can do that is by engaging in what we call political activity. So why do we care about power and politics and innovation? Well, for all the reasons I just mentioned them. Political skills are increasingly being recognised in the management literature as something that's really important for us to be able to understand, to be able to utilise in organisations to effectively manage not just ourselves, but the situations that we find ourselves in. And for our purposes, particularly around managing an innovation through an organisation. So as I mentioned earlier on, sometimes there can be a pretty narrow or myopic view of political skills as things that are quite negative. It's about self-interest, just what people want. It's negative. It has has bad outcomes for organisations. But again, as I mentioned at the start, we're expanding that view a bit here because certainly it can be negative, but we also know that there can be positive outcomes from engaging in this type of activity in organisations. So I wanted to just up front give you a little bit of a sense of, from a piece of a smaller piece of research by Hartley et al. 2007. It's one of our readings this week. It's a nice, easy read. They step you through the survey that they did, looking at managers. I think it was in the public sector, trying to get an understanding of what do they think politics means. And actually, what they found is that almost 60%, most of them, almost 2/3 of those managers said politics is about alliance building to achieve organisational outcomes. So already you can get a sense that people out in the workplace and industry, out in government, don't necessarily see this as a negative thing. It can be about trying to build a coalition or group of people to achieve what it is the organisation wants to do. So fewer managers actually viewed politics in terms of those negative connotations that we've talked about. So protecting their turf, pursuing personal advantage or self-interest. Only about 30 and 20% respectively of respondents to this survey thought that was the case. So what this means is, again, we're shifting away from this idea that politics always has to be negative in organisations. And in fact, it can be used effectively. There's a fine line here, but the last few lines on the last point here I think are important. So it's already an emerging view where managers see politics as a means of achieving collaboration and reconciling difference, and that can actually help organisations to achieve their outcomes. So what do we mean by power and politics? So here are a couple of definitions. The one about power is fine. The one about politics, I'll give you another definition as well. Again, this comes to the duality of the term. So power is defined as potential. Okay, it's just the ability to, the capacity to. It's somebody else or a group of other people to do things they might not otherwise want to do, and or they might resist your efforts to get them to do what others want them to do. So you might see some comparison here with how we defined influencing. So there's a similarity here, okay? And I want us to just be mindful of the link here. Excuse me. So influencing can certainly be part of political activity. And in fact, in this lecture, you'll see at some point I talk about the fact that one of the strategies in political activity can be influencing others. So we've looked at proactive influencing strategies previously in this course. So let's just be mindful again. I've said before, there are lots of links between the content here in this course, and certainly influencing and influencing tactics and strategies play a role here in terms of power and in terms of the sort of political activity that we can engage in organizations. So essentially power is the potential to be able to get somebody to do something they might not otherwise do. So you might have expert power. I'll define some of these types in a second. Referent power, legitimate power. You might actually hold that, and that's great, but it's just power at this point, so you're not actually doing anything with it. If you choose to do something with it, then that's when you are actually actively influencing, or for our purposes in this module, you are actively engaging in some political activity or behaviour. So politics is defined as enacted power. You're doing something with the power that you have. It's goal-directed action, and this is probably a harder definition of what politics is. And this is from Frost and Negri. They suggest that, first of all, it's self-interested, and I've got in brackets and italics there, well, not everyone thinks that, and it would be resisted if detected by others with different self-interests, maybe. So you can see that that definition is probably leaning towards the more negative view of what politics is. I'll come to what I call a gentler definition in a minute. But what do we mean by power in politics? So what I've got on this slide is drawn from the Mintzberg reading. I've talked about Henry Mintzberg very briefly before in one of our workshops. So Mintzberg actually has a really interesting paper, so please have a look at it. We draw upon just a bit of it where we look at the different political games that people can play in organisations. And they're referenced a lot. So again, this is another super important paper. So politics can be considered, according to Mintzberg, as one among a number of systems of influence in an organisation. So he identifies a few systems of influence, or how things get done in organisations: authority, ideology, and expertise. He calls them legitimate in some sense, legitimate systems of getting things done in organisations. So they're the terms are fairly intuitive. So a system of authority defines power that is formal, that's allocated on an explicit and legally sanctioned basis. So that is probably best described through the roles that people play in organisations, the formal job titles and roles that individuals have, their particular place in an organisational hierarchy, the level at which they are at. That all forms part of the system of authority. So it's very clear. What we mean by explicit and legally sanctioned is that everybody knows it, they understand it. It's probably what's portrayed to the public or to stakeholders and shareholders. This is how we operate in the organisation. So it's quite open and transparent. You can see it. The system of ideology comes more to what I'd call organisational culture. So it's not as explicit as a system of authority. It's more implicit. And I've got there represents norms and beliefs that are widely accepted in the organisation. So that comes to this idea of organisational culture. How do we do things around here? How do people interact? Right down to quite specific things like how people dress, the sort of language that they use, etc. So that's another system of influence. And the final one that he calls legitimate, that Mintzberg identifies, is a system of expertise. So this is about power that derives from what I've got there on that an official basis, typically sanctioned by formal authority. So there is some link to a system of authority. But expertise, as the name suggests, is about that technical skill or knowledge that people have in organisations. And some groups and organisations might have higher levels of expertise, might be technological or scientific or policy or whatever, but they have a specific set of knowledge and skills and ability that they can derive expert power from. So those are what Mintzberg calls legitimate systems of influence in an organisation. Now, he contrasts that with what he means by politics. So he says a system of politics is another system of influence in the organisation, but actually this is not technically legitimate. So he calls it illegitimate or alegitimate. Basically, he says system of politics is generally not authorised behaviour, it's not sanctioned behaviour, it's not explicit behaviour or necessarily widely accepted in an organisation. It occurs. Now, if you have a look at Mintzberg's paper, you probably get a sense that he is subscribing to a more negative view of what politics is in the organisation. And you can see that in the last dot point there. He suggests it's typically divisive and conflictive or conflictual. It pits individuals and groups against each other. And often it pits itself as a system of influence against those more legitimate systems of authority, ideology, or culture and expertise. So again, continue with what do we mean by power and politics? I said I was going to come to a gentler definition or approach to this term. Again, identifying the duality of it. And here it is. So Hartley et al.'s paper takes that gentler approach. And they identify politics as a means to achieving collaboration or reconciling difference that can help to deliver organisational objectives. So as I mentioned earlier, they talk about things in that paper or what managers identify as coalition building or alliance building, getting individuals or groups' interests. They might be quite different, diverse, potentially conflicting interests out on the table. And the political activity for them is understanding how do we reach some sort of reconciliation so that we can collaborate and move forward, reach a position that people are generally comfortable with and can move forward from. And so that's what I would call a gentler approach to politics or definition of politics. So we'll come to explicitly looking at what those positives and negatives are of political activity in a minute. Let's take a short break and then we'll firstly start by talking about different sorts of power before looking at more explicitly those pros and cons of political activity.